My fiancé said, "Stay home with the kids. My family trip is more important." The trip I paid for. I nodded. Of course. No argument. No scene. That night, I made one quiet decision. By the time they landed, something they all depended on was already gone. When you fund someone's absence from your own life, the least you can do is make sure the accounting is accurate. Subscribe to Voxa Narrator right now, because this story is only the beginning of what quiet decisions look like when they finally land. I'm 35 years old, and I'm sitting in the kitchen of a house that has been unusually quiet for 3 days now. And I want to be precise about the quality of that quiet because it's different from the quiet I'm used to. I'm used to the quiet of early mornings before the kids wake up, that particular still hour between 5 and 6 when the house is mine in the way it almost never is otherwise. This quiet is different. This is the quiet of a house where the person who reorganizes. Every room she enters isn't here, and the reorganization has stopped, and everything is sitting exactly where I left it, and I'm finding that I prefer it this way, which is the kind of preference that, once identified, cannot be unidentified. My fiancée is 3 time zones away with her family. The flight I paid for. The resort I booked on a card in my name. The spending money that was sourced from an account she has access to because I extended that access 18 months ago when we combined our financial lives in the specific, trust-based way that people do when they believe they're building something permanent. I said of course when she told me to stay home. I nodded. I helped them pack. I drove them to the airport the morning of the departure, and I kissed her on the cheek, and I told her to have a good time, and I watched the automatic doors close behind her, and her mother and her 2 sisters, and I drove home in the specific silence of a man who has just fully understood, something he'd been half understanding for a long time. Then I put the kids to bed, and I sat at this kitchen table and I made decisions that were going to matter considerably more than the nodding. Let me tell you how we got here, because stay home with the kids, my family trip is more important, delivered about a trip the speaker didn't pay for is a sentence with a history behind it. And the history is what makes the sentence what it is. I met her 4 years ago. We have 2 children together, 4 and 6, both mine, both hers, both the realest things in my life and the reason I've stayed patient through things that should have ended my patience much sooner. I want to be honest about that. The children are why I kept finding more goodwill than the situation deserved. Not as a trap or a manipulation, as a genuine calculation about what uprooting a life costs kids at those ages, and whether the things I was tolerating were worth tolerating for the sake of stability. For a long time I believed the answer was yes. I'm revising that belief. The pattern I'm going to describe took time to become visible as a pattern, because each individual instance had a deniable explanation, and I was, for much of the 4 years, applying the charitable interpretation that love encourages. In retrospect, the charitable interpretation was doing a lot of work that accurate observation could have done more honestly. She had a family, a close one by her account, and by the evidence of how much space they occupied in our shared life. Her mother, her 2 sisters, a rotating cast of extended relatives who appeared at significant intervals and were treated as standing priorities regardless of what else was scheduled around them. The closeness was real. I want to be fair about that. I've always wanted to be fair. But the closeness operated with a specific directional logic that took me a long time to name accurately, which was that her family's needs and wants consistently ranked above mine, our children's routines, and the commitments we'd made as a couple, and this ranking was not negotiable, and was presented as an aspect of who she was rather than a choice she was making. In the first year, I accommodated it because new relationships involve learning another person's priorities and adjusting to them. In the second year, I started noting the places where the adjustment was one-directional. By the 3rd year, I had raised it, carefully and more than once, and each time the raising had been met with a version of the same response. Her family was her family. She wasn't going to be made to choose, and my discomfort with the situation said something about my inability to support her rather than something about the situation. The financial dimension became significant in year 2. I'm not going to pretend the finances are the heart of this story because they're not. The heart of this story is about being told to stay home from a trip you paid for, which is a sentence that contains its own complete summary of a dynamic. But the finances are the mechanism through which everything else operated, and the mechanism needs to be understood. I earn well. Significantly better than she does, which is not a judgment, it's a context. When we combined finances, I did so with the assumption that shared meant shared, that the financial foundation I'd built would support us together, both directions, with mutual respect for what it represented and what it required to maintain. What it became, over the following 18 months, was an infrastructure she and her family learned to depend on, while I learned to be grateful for being allowed to provide it. The trip. I need to describe the trip's origin because the origin is where the real character of the thing lives. 8 months ago, her mother mentioned, at a family dinner I'd funded at a restaurant, her sister had chosen that it would be wonderful to do a family trip. Something international, a resort somewhere warm. Her mother and both sisters, a real trip, the kind of thing they'd talked about doing for years but hadn't managed. My fiancée brought it to me that same evening, not as a question, as a plan requiring logistics. It would mean so much to my mom, she said. That sounds like a wonderful thing for them to do, I said, hearing the framing and deciding to test it with accuracy. When are they thinking? When are we thinking? I thought you said your mom and sisters. It's a family trip. We're family. I want to note the specific movement in that sentence. The trip had been presented, 60 minutes earlier, as something her mother and sisters wanted to do. In the time between that dinner and this conversation, it had become a family trip that included me. The inclusion was not presented as an invitation. It was presented as a corrected understanding. What are you thinking in terms of budget? I said. She named a figure. I looked at it for a moment. That's for how many people? Mom, me, my sisters, and you and the kids, obviously. I did the math. It was a significant number. The kind of number that requires planning and allocation and a conscious decision about what else that money could do. I want to talk about this properly before it becomes a plan, I said. It's for my mom, she said, in the tone that meant the conversation was already over and I was the only one who hadn't received the memo. I talked about it properly. The proper talking produced a version of the conversation I'd had before, where the subject became my willingness to support her family rather than the specific logistics of a significant financial commitment. I agreed, eventually, to look at options. Looking at options became researching options. Researching options became booking options. Booking options became a booking, on my card, for 6 people, for 7 nights, at a resort that had been chosen by her sisters and approved by her mother and presented to me as a fait accompli with a price tag attached. I want to be honest, I'd said yes along the way. Each individual step had my nominal agreement. What I want to be equally honest about is that nominal agreement extracted through the specific technique of making every question about the project into a question about whether I loved her family is not the same thing as genuine consent to a large financial decision. The agreement was the path of least resistance through a conversation that had been structured to make any other path feel like a declaration of hostility. I'm not pretending I wasn't complicit. I'm naming what the complicity was complicit with. The trip was scheduled for a Wednesday. The previous Sunday was when she told me I wasn't going. We were at the kitchen table. I keep coming back to this table, which is apparently where all the significant things happen in this house. And she was going over the packing list with her phone out, and she said, with the specific casual finality of someone communicating a decision that had already been made, "I think it'll be better if you stay home with the kids." I looked up from what I was reading. "I was planning to come," I said. "I know, but it's a family thing. My family. The kids would be disruptive at the resort. My mom wants it to be relaxed. Our kids are going to be disruptive at a resort their father paid for. Don't make it about money." I'm not making it about money. I'm making it about the fact that I'm in this family too, and this trip was presented as something we were doing together. My mom is more comfortable without, look, it's just more relaxed without the full household situation. My sisters don't have kids. It changes the dynamic. I looked at her for a moment. Thought about 8 months of planning, the booking on my card, the 6 people whose flights and rooms and resort access I'd funded, the conversation I'd tried to have 8 months ago that had been redirected. You're asking me to stay home from a trip I paid for, I said. You're making it weird. I'm making it accurate. My family's comfort matters. I don't understand why you can't just... She stopped, resorted to the version that had always worked before. If you loved me and my family the way you say you do, you wouldn't make this into a thing. I looked at her. 35 years old, sitting at my kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening, being told that loving her family correctly means funding their vacation and then staying home from it. Of course, I said. She blinked. Yeah? Stay home with the kids, of course. She looked at me with the slight uncertainty of someone who'd gotten the answer they wanted, delivered in a quality they weren't sure about. Thank you. It really means a lot. I know, I said. I helped them pack Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday morning, I loaded their bags into the car, buckled the kids into their seats, drove to the airport. Her mother was warm to me in the specific way of someone who has gotten what she wanted and can afford to be generous now. Her sisters were pleasant. My fiancé kissed me on the cheek. I told them to have a wonderful time. I drove home, put the kids down for a rest, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop. The first thing I did was access the shared account, the account that was mine in origin and hers in access, the one that had been funding the shared infrastructure of our life for 18 months and that had, over those months, become the quiet engine that ran everything from groceries to her personal subscriptions to the standing transfers she'd established for things she categorized as joint expenses and that I'd never fully audited. I audited it now. The audit took 2 hours and produced a document I've looked at several times since because the document is clarifying in the way that actual numbers always are. Standing transfers I hadn't reviewed in over a year, subscriptions that had been added to the account without a conversation, a recurring payment to a service I'd never heard of, established 8 months ago, modest enough to be invisible in ordinary review, 3 separate subscriptions to streaming and shopping platforms in her name on my payment method. I addressed each one methodically. The standing transfers, I canceled all of them, with the exception of 2 that related directly to household expenses for the children, which I was not touching because the children are not part of this accounting. The subscriptions in her name, removed from the payment method. The service I didn't recognize, canceled. The shopping platforms, removed my card from each account, which would leave her accounts intact but without my funding attached. Then I looked at the shared access itself, the account access she'd had for 18 months. I called the bank, asked about the process for adjusting shared access on the account. The process was straightforward. I initiated it. The bank sent a confirmation. The change would process within 24 hours. Then I looked at the resort booking. The booking was in my name, paid for, confirmed. 7 nights, 6 guests. There was a modification option. I accessed the reservation, and I removed 3 guest names, her mother and both sisters. Their rooms had been booked as separate units. The modification was clean and complete. The rooms would release back to the resort's inventory. I would receive a partial credit back to my card. I want to be careful about something here. I did not remove her from the booking. She was my fiancée. She was the mother of my children. I was not going to strand her at an international resort. The children's rooms I left intact. Her room I left intact. What I removed was the 3 rooms belonging to the people whose comfort was more important than my presence. Then I sat back, and I thought about what I was going to say to her, and when. I decided, not by phone while they were in transit, not by text, not in any format that could be managed from a distance and arrived back to me, filtered through her interpretation of it. When she landed and they arrived at the resort and discovered that 3 of the 6 rooms had been canceled and released, she would call, and I would answer, and we would have the conversation in real time, without preparation on her end, which was the only format in which honest conversation had ever been available to us. The call came 7 hours after they landed. I was giving the kids dinner when my phone buzzed and I saw her photo on the screen. I set down the wooden spoon, told the kids I'd be right back. Went to the hallway. "The rooms are gone," she said. Her voice was the specific tight quality of someone who is furious and is in a public place and cannot express the fury at its full scale. "I know," I said. "What did you do?" I canceled your mother's and sister's rooms. Yours and the kids are intact. Why would you? A pause. I could hear her breathing, heard her moving somewhere quieter, heard the ambient resort sounds receding. They're standing at the front desk right now. There's no room for them. I know. I'm sorry for the inconvenience to them. Sorry. You're sorry. You did this deliberately. You canceled their rooms and said nothing and let them fly out there, and I paid for a trip I was told to stay home from, I said. I thought about what that sentence meant for a few days, and I made an adjustment. This is insane. You've lost your mind. My mother is standing at a resort with no room because you decided to throw a tantrum. I didn't throw anything. I made a decision, quietly, and I implemented it. Your mother and sisters can book rooms if they'd like. The resort has availability. They'll need to use their own cards. The silence that followed was long and had several layers. I waded through all of them. You're doing this because I asked you to stay home, she said finally. Quieter now, the fury at a lower frequency. I'm doing this because you told me your family's comfort mattered more than my presence on a trip I funded, and I agreed with you. And then I thought about what agreeing actually looked like in practical terms. We're going to lose the engagement over this. Is that what you want? I want honesty, I said. I want the version of this relationship where what I contribute is acknowledged rather than expected and then exceeded. I want to not be told to stay home from the trip I paid for. I've wanted those things for a while. We can talk about all of it when you get back. She hung up. She called back 20 minutes later with a different quality of voice, some of the fury spent, something harder and more structural underneath it. She said her mother was upset. I said I understood, and that I was sorry her mother had experienced the inconvenience. She said her sisters were angry. I said I understood, and that I hoped they could find rooms at a rate that worked for them. She said I'd humiliated her. I said, you told me to stay home from my own investment. I adjusted the investment to match my presence. I don't think humiliation is the right word for that. I think accuracy is closer. The kids and I have been fine. We made pancakes this morning. We watched something they'd been wanting to watch. We went to the park in the afternoon in the late autumn light that makes everything look amber and real and specific. They slept well, and I sat at the kitchen table and wrote this. The engagement is, as of this moment, in the ambiguous territory between intact and not. She returns in 4 days. The conversation is scheduled by implication. Neither of us has said we need to talk because the last 4 days have been one long ongoing version of that conversation, across time zones, in fragments, and the in-person version is simply its continuation. I have a list, not a grievance list, a clarity list. The things I need to be true for the marriage we've been moving toward to be something I'm willing to move toward. The list is specific and non-negotiable, and was written with the clear-headed attention of a man who has been sitting alone in his kitchen for 3 days with his children and his audit and his reclaimed quiet. Whether she's willing to meet the list is her decision. I've spent 4 years making decisions to accommodate what she needed. This is the first week in 4 years where I've made decisions based entirely on what the situation actually required. It feels like the right kind of quiet. Now tell me something honest. Have you ever paid for something and then been excluded from it? Have you ever funded someone's comfort at the cost of your own dignity? Tell me in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who waited too long to say enough. Edit. The comments want to know about her mother and sisters, whether they found rooms, whether they stayed at the resort. Yes, they found rooms at significantly higher rack rates than the early booking rate I'd secured, and they stayed. This information came through a brief message from her middle sister that was phrased as an update, but read as an invoice in waiting. I responded politely and said I was glad they'd sorted it. No further response from the sister. I note this detail not to be satisfied about it, but because the resolution was practical and clean and exactly as inconvenient as the situation deserved to be. Edit 2. Someone asked why I didn't simply refuse to go along with the trip in the first place 8 months ago. Honest answer, because I'd been making the same calculation I'd been making for 4 years, which was that the cost of the accommodation was less than the cost of the conflict that resistance would produce. What changed Sunday night when she told me to stay home wasn't new information about who she was. I had that information. What changed was my assessment of the calculation. The cost of accommodation had, over 4 years, compounded into something that was no longer survivable without losing myself in the process. The trip wasn't the cause. The trip was the place where the number finally came due. If this story moved something in you, if it clarified something you've been carrying, drop it in the comments below. Say the thing you haven't said out loud yet. I'm reading every single one, and this thread is more honest than most conversations I've had in 4 years.